Hello everyone, my name is Ben Eady and I'm an online media manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled How Requirements, Repositories, and Reusability Can Help Achieve a Competitive Advantage. Today's featured speaker is Keith Ellis from Infocus Solutions, and the webinar will last approximately 16 minutes including the Q&A session. So make sure you submit your questions in advance using the questions feature on the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to Infocus for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Keith to get us started.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate you taking the time to introduce me, and I want to welcome everybody to Requirements, Repositories, and Reusability. I want everybody to try to say that 3 times fast. Today's discussion is really about the harvesting of corporate knowledge. And it's when you think about corporate knowledge, you think about sort of general reference information. You know, sure, that's easy to deal with because when you want to find out what your vacation entitlement or something like that is, you can go up on a wiki or you can go on a SharePoint. There's a bunch of places you can deal with that because it's, general index corporate information. But requirements information is very different. It's so interconnected. There's a fabric to it. There's states to it. There's many different aspects to this that create many complexities in terms of, well, how do I then deal with this? What is effective in terms of a repository? And how do I make reusability work for me in my organization? Because that promise of reusability has been out there for a long time. The second thing I've got on the subtitle is how you can achieve a competitive advantage, which, wow, that's a big statement, competitive advantage. What does that mean for people? And that really depends on how a business analyst defines their job. All right, and I know that's a little bit in people's face, but when you think about it, is the analyst really defining their job as, my job is to go get business requirements, go define requirements or solution requirements for a particular system, or you could define that job much more broadly, which is you're in the business of turning great business ideas into action. And that's really what business analysts, in my opinion, do, is they take great business ideas, sometimes not so great ones, and they try to drive that into action. Understand, what is it going to take? How do I socialize this across the organization? How do I engage all the parties that need to be involved in operationalizing this and turn that thing that we've thought about into action? Now, there's also a hashtag if you want to follow along on this presentation on Twitter. My compatriot, Andre Pelton, is out there monitoring that particular one so that you can engage a side conversation. We've got about 900 people participating in today's conversation or today's presentation. So what I do is just encourage you to use that and participate along. Now, in addition to that, you've also got the Q&A. Now, the Q&A will come directly to me. I will commit to answering every question that I see. I'm trying to. If I miss it during the show, because, again, we've got a fair number of people participating today, if I miss it during the discussion, then I will commit to answering it before we get out to the weekend, okay? Now, Patty, you had asked, can you get a copy of the deck? I am going to give you Andrea's email address at the end of the presentation. And I may be forcing you to stick around, but Andrea's email address at the end, and you can send her a request, and she'll turn around and send you the deck, okay? So what are we going to talk about today? Fundamentally, what is it that creates value when you're dealing with requirements repositories? You see, not all information is equal. It doesn't all have equal weight. And I might surprise you a little bit about what I'm going to suggest you start thinking about and focusing on, because requirements are most valuable when connected and in context. And what I mean by that is the fact that you've got a system shall statement and a requirement repository with a bunch of system shall statements doesn't necessarily get you going in terms of, creating the connectedness. It's the context of the requirements that creates power in terms of understanding, well, where did this come from? Who did it? Where is this going to? Was it implemented? All these kinds of things create that connection for people. And then finally, can repositories deliver standardization? And, I want to kick this off by saying, is that kind of silly thinking? Is that kind of a silly thing to say? Can the repository itself deliver standardization? I want you to visualize this for just a second and tell me if this is kind of crazy, okay? The fact that you've defined a template and you defined a process and you've stuck it up there on a server somewhere, all right, is that going to get you standardization? Just answer the Q&A blank there. Is that going to get you standardization? Okay, overwhelmingly, no, it's not. Well, how come people think that a repository is going to do that for you? Now, there are conditions under which absolutely this is going to happen, okay? There are conditions if you do certain things, you will drive standardization. Hey, by the way, Tom, thank you very much for your kind words. Yes, you missed me after I left IAG. I appreciate your kind words there. If you inject the repository into the process of doing your work, then you change the way the repository is used, and then all of a sudden you drive standardization. So let me introduce a couple of ideas. So Infocus Solutions, I just want to give you a little bit of background about who we are and what we're all about. And a lot of you guys may know me from past webinars. I think it's about 100,000 people over the years have attended webinars that I've done. So Infocus Solutions is a SaaS offering. We work with organizations out there, and we offer business analysts our software solution, which fundamentally composes the pieces on the right. But at root, it's business analysis software, so people can drive through the requirements much more quickly with far fewer errors. A professional development platform, which people use to get the required skills at and when they need, but also the information they need to share out to their stakeholders to kind of continue to encourage that organizational change. And then that dynamic collaboration environment so that they can work much more efficiently with their stakeholders. And the whole thing is really about achieving results. And so there's a little snapshot of all the components of the requirements suite on the right-hand side. But again, it's the requirements repository, the collaboration with the stakeholders, and then a component in there we call enterprise portfolio, which is really about helping organizations to make sure that they're linking out to the enterprise architecture. And behind this is what we call the requirements excellence framework. So many of the ideas that I'm talking about today will come from aspects of the requirements excellence framework, which is an end-to-end methodology in terms of going and doing requirements, but it's also included or packaged in as part of the overall suite. And I don't want to take up a lot of time talking about Infocus Solutions. What I want to do is just drive to these learning objectives. And by the way, if I don't hit these learning objectives, I'm sure people can flame me using Twitter or send me the cranky email or put it into the Q&A area, and we can go through it. So the best practice, we're going to talk about best practices in knowledge management. Fundamentally, knowledge management is really about, repositories are really about knowledge management. You have to look at that and say, well, what am I trying to accomplish? I want to talk about building the business case for business analysis requirements repositories, because that aspect of this whole thing is critical. What is it about this that you can talk to your boss about and say, this is why we need to do these kinds of things? When you think of business analysts out there, they are fundamentally the most under-tooled segment of the professional population today, right? Very few business analysts have the requisite tools they need to do their job. They're doing it the same way they did it back in the 80s, essentially, Word and Visio. There are a lot of challenges in building the repository, but most importantly, you've got to think about linking that repository to your business architecture and promoting standardization as a result of doing this. So these are components to it. I'm not going to talk to these in exactly this order, but I want to make sure I talk to all of these. And I want to start by just kind of going back, do deference to the IIBA and say, well, what is it that they said? And I found this wonderful slide which kind of summarizes IIBA and some of its positioning on requirements repositories. Is when you look at the words in here and you see things like a requirements repository is a method of storing requirements under development, those under review, and those approved. Well, that implies that the repository itself has to have process. It has to have in it some aspect that says, this moves through a flow, or I need to be able to look and go in and understand where something is in that flow. Repositories maybe include whiteboards. One of the most common things people put up in ours is pictures of whiteboards these days. They're doing facilitation sessions. They take their handheld camera, you take your phone, the smartphone, you take a picture of the whiteboard and you upload it into the repository. It makes sense. It's the way people work today, right? But that's not what a repository is. But in this case here, a repository could be anything according here, but it's got to be a single source available to all. And I got to say, you know, the number one place where people are storing their requirements today, I guarantee it, is Outlook, because it's in email. Most of the time, is because requirements are so interactive, most of the time people are using mainly Outlook and things like that to actually be the storage repository of requirements, and that's just not a good thing, right? I don't know if you'd agree with me on that, but a lot of times that's what's going to happen out there. So there's not a lot of guidance here. Like, what is it? What do I do? What do I need? And when you go to the requirements types, it gets even more abstract. You've got these different requirement types now, PMBOK coming forward with its own requirement types, and IABA coming forward, but you have to say there are different types of information, right, that you need to manage on the way through. And I want you to look at this list: business requirements, stakeholder requirements, solution requirements, different types of solution, functional, non-functional, transition requirements. How are you going to do this on paper, right? And as Jason rightly points out, the change control is the biggest issue on this, right? As you step forward, you say, well, now I've got changing business requirements which cascade to stakeholder, which cascade to solution, which, by the way, all end up in transition. The problem just compounds on itself. What I want to do is step back and say what's going on behind the scenes. And what really impacts people is not thinking this kind of visceral, what happens perspective. What are you really asking of employees behind the scenes when you're dealing with a repository? One is, it's all about tacit knowledge. It's all about, I understand something. It's in my head. And I've got two people who are interacting, right? And one person's got questions and the other's got knowledge. What we're trying to do is substitute the repository for the person on the right simply going across and asking the person on the left, hey, what's the answer to this question, right? What's the answer? Because what you're really doing is you're asking that person on the left, the person with that knowledge, they understand something, take that tacit knowledge, and they've got to codify it. In other words, they've got to write it down somewhere, or they've got to model it. They have to take that knowledge and package it in a way that should be understandable for other people, right? It's not just a Word document or something like that. And then they got to store it somewhere. It's in a repository. They're going to store it and say, well, now I need that person who's on the left to take the time to select how and where I'm going to put that knowledge. And then I need the person on the right to say, I understand why I need to use this knowledge here rather than go to the guy with the knowledge or go to this individual and ask. I need that person to be able to search and find what I need. I need them to decodify it or interpret it. In other words, accurately review what's in that repository, read it, view it, interact it, and interpret it correctly, and then turn that into tacit knowledge. I understand the situation. Now, how many failure points do you see in here? Just count them up. Give me your answer in the Q&A. Everyone, absolutely. Joe, at least 5. Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Every single one of these points, right, is a potential failure point. So what you need to do is step back and say, you've got this tacit, that person understand it correctly, codify, are they writing it down? Where are the points? So this is more complicated. Let me layer in something else. Somebody jumped ahead and said there's 8. Okay, yeah. There's a motivation problem as well, because this whole thing assumes that the person on the left actually has the desire to help out others. I know that's a weird thing to say, but in order to get that person to write down their knowledge, they have to take time out of their job, and it's a time pressure situation, and they have to, under a time pressure situation, prioritize the need to share knowledge. That's pretty challenging, right? The next thing is they have to have the training and discipline to codify and store it in the right place. The person on the right needs to say, it's faster to go to the repository than just to ask somebody else. And they have to have the desire to learn. So you need to think through not only what are you doing with this, but you need to think through, am I motivating people properly in the structure to do this? Now, have I surprised a lot of people by coming forward and saying, whoa, this is a lot more complicated than it looks on the surface? Probably because a lot of people are simply storing knowledge. They're simply storing, well, what is it that I know? And that's, it can be very valuable. So I want to talk about how most repositories start. They basically start by having, there's a lot of information that VAs need to know. Analysts need to know about planning and monitoring. They need to know about elicitation, so let's store some information on that. They need to know about requirements in terms of solution assessment, etc. Right? I need all this stuff. So let's get some of those basic points in time. Let's make sure we understand that. And then, oh, by the way, geez, you know what? We should add something in here about project management and, oh, yeah, financial analysis. We're doing business cases. We should add that in there. Business knowledge. Yeah, you know what? We're a software company. We should make sure we're picking up some of that because it's, well, risk management. Yeah, you know what? We were talking about that. We saw a seminar last week on that. And then enterprise architects are showing up and the technology SMEs are showing up. We should deal with that. Oh, structured analysis. Good thing you brought that particular point up because, there's a lot of structured analysis techniques out there that impact this thing, like use cases and vendor assessment and focus groups and how we should run that. We should put all that stuff in there because it's important to have that good stuff there. And, geez, organizational change and some of these other kinds of things, you know what? You're right. Some of the solutions out there that we're looking at we should be picking up. You see how this is starting to get messy? Right? Now all of a sudden you get your standards in there. What has happened to your repository? What started off as a simple thing. What we need is something that helps people in the job task. It morphs very quickly into something that's basically a wide collection, what I call requirements hoarding. It's not subject-specific enough to drive, and it can continue to get worse depending on what you're driving through. So there's different variations in here. And what I want to talk about is I don't like doing the Chicken Little thing where I just talk about problems. Let's focus in and get down into what are some very specific things that people can do, what are the issues that you get into, how do you then begin adjusting this and going forward. So requirements modeling on one extreme, okay, is extremely high levels of codification. I call it requirements modeling because the more you take something and codify it, the more you structure the knowledge, the more you're tending to go to a model. Does that resonate for people? Does that make sense? The more you structure the knowledge, the more you're basically going to a BPMN model or a process model of some kind or a use case model or you're doing an enterprise architecture thing. They tend to be very single-point user because the more you codify knowledge, the more you codify it to a very specific single-point use. Do you believe me when I say that? It tends to go toward a single-point use. So it tends to be an individual organization, like architecture guys, forcing the rest of the organizations to use their models to do requirements. On the other side, you got what I call requirements hoarding. It's basically all knowledge, no organization. And that's the situation I just pointed out, right, where people are trying to capture knowledge for the use of business analysts, and it's basically kind of everything. It's a SharePoint drive or it's a whatever. It's got a lot of information on how to do requirements, but it's not got as much structure or organization behind it. And it goes well beyond a requirements repository, into three or four different things. So the knowledge and organization is not there. The requirements for repository is a balance. It's really about making sure you're capturing not just the factual. So requirements modeling tends to be just the factual knowledge. You need to capture the contextual knowledge. So what's the fact of the requirement? Now, what's the context of that thing within the organization, and then codify it to some extent. It is a balance. It's a balance between these 2 points to make sure you're capturing the right information in context. The people can have a lot of information in there, but it's not forcing a structure that people can't understand on the repository itself, okay? So there's some golden rules, okay, that I want to share with you just in conclusion to this section and keep on trucking along. People are far more willing to search for knowledge than they are to share. Now, you can get a reversal on that where you get everybody really just wanting to add to a centralized repository of knowledge, and that's fantastic. It's really good to do that, and I'm sure a number of you out there have that situation going on for your organization. Kind of maybe you've got something like that, looks like that. But generally speaking, people will be far more willing to search than to share. So you'll tend to have fewer people who are participating properly. It's a difficult situation to get over. The only way to get over that is to embed the use of the repository right into the business process. And that's what I need to focus on with you today is how do you go about doing that? Every repository out there needs, subject, context to get contribution. I want you to think, if the repository is this massive jumble of everything in the world about business analysis, how much contribution are you going to get to that? Nobody knows exactly how to evolve it. I want you to think about why wikis are so powerful. And maybe you agree with me or disagree with me on this. Wikis are so powerful because they organize into subject areas, and people begin to have resonance. Oh, I need information in this, or oh, I am a subject expert in this, and I want to contribute, right? That's what makes them so powerful. But the flip side of that is also true, okay? The interpretive context is required to get utilization, okay? I need to, remember when I put up that thing, I said, I need people to be motivated to contribute, but I also need them to be motivated to use it, to grab that information. It's two sides to create. It's a supply and demand issue when you're dealing with repositories. So you need to be able to deal with the only way you're going to get usage, okay? The only way is to drive that subjective context through to people. I'm going to talk more about what that is. Codification is a balance. Too little and it's hoarding. Too much, you end up with a single-purpose system. And as a result of that, it's going to be a problem. And there's two basic types of integration that need to make sure that happen to get repositories to work. One is make the repository part of the daily work environment. And I'll talk to you about how and why. Because if you implement or go forward with repositories like this, what you can do is fundamentally change the way analysts work, driving far more efficiency, but also making the job tasking so much easier because it changes how you allocate work amongst people. And you want to make sure that you ensure that the repository is interacting with other information systems. So there may be something there in terms of doing EA or enterprise architecture or portfolio, integrated development environment. There's lots of different things. So let's talk about repositories and what creates value. And I want to slow just a little bit here, guys. Okay? So I introduced a whole series of concepts. And those concepts are mainly problem-centric, right? Problem-centric. And Katya, when you talk about how to organize the wiki structure, final editing, the metadata, you're right. There's the problem with wikis is that they're just buckets. You fill in the buckets of information, and you've got to kind of pre-select. But requirements are different in that they also have state, right? They move through a work process. And as a result, you get into these different issues underlying it. And that's what I want to focus on in this next thing, is what creates value. And when you look at what creates value, you start to say, well, wait a minute now. Many tools, like Word, Visio, they were never defined or never ever designed with the idea of collaboration in mind. That's not what they're for, right? When you think about what wikis are, they're not defined or designed well for requirements repository either, because they're kind of static in terms of how they're structured. They don't deal well with a work process underneath them. So let's talk about what has to happen to create value in the repository so that when you're thinking about this, you can move forward with something that works, okay? So the context is the most important issue. A requirement on its own, how much value does that have? Answer. Go ahead, put it in the thing. One requirement, sitting on its own. The system shall, whatever. How much value does that statement have on its own? Patty, none. Diane saying none. Paula, none, not much. Everybody's basically saying very, very little. What creates value for that statement? Now, remember, I hate to poke, but I will a little bit. The old systems back from the 80s, what did they do? They basically said you got to have all these system shall statements. You're going to stick them in there as single line items, and you're going to establish traceability amongst them, right? We've just agreed that that statement has little value, right? It has little value. So how valuable is it to only manage those single point statements? None, right? So what you have to do is you have to manage the context of the statement. As Thomas says, it's about defining the what and the why, right? So that requirement has two things. One is it rolls up to a higher level of abstraction, which is a feature, a unit of business value, which is something that the executive team are going to understand, and it rolls down. It has more detail. It gets elaborated by requirement attributes. That's the next stage on this thing, because I need to understand, well, what exactly do you mean by that thing, right? And they have patterns and things like that, right? So while the pattern, or while the collection of single point statements is necessary, as Patty says, it is not the most, it's not the value that you're harvesting. It's the context that you are harvesting. And so the requirement sits as part of a feature set. It sits and has requirement attributes that are associated with it. But it also has a project-related context, right? Where did I do this requirement? How did I change this? How was it impacted? And oh, by the way, outside that project context, I have a broader context of, well, what was the intent of this thing? The expected benefits for a sponsor, or what is this thing exactly impacting? Who or what does this impact? Service or persona, process, data rules, etc. Where is this from a workflow perspective? And this is where SharePoint and others kind of break down, because who did the work? What's next to do? What are the issues, the defects, resolution? There's a whole workflow around requirements. It's not that they just magically show up. They have to go through a cycle of ideation, elaboration, approval. All these other kinds of things are states that requirements sit in, right? So unless you're physically moving them from bucket to bucket when you're dealing with a SharePoint site, it's very difficult to deal with. And then there's a history, a log of change, approval, and implementation, right? Now, these are the connections. This is the context. So if I told you, here is the requirement, and I gave you these other elements of it, could you interpret what was done? Give me that answer, guys. Could you interpret what was done? I said, here's the requirement, here's the intent of that requirement, here's who or what it impacts. That's the traceability part. That's coming back to what EL is saying. Here's who did the work, what's to do next, issue defect on that requirement, here's a change log. Is that something that you could use and interpret? Yes, exactly. So there's my point, guys, okay? There's my point. The whole thing is about context, and I'm just responding to Laura, Gary, Tina, Linda, Susan, Rebecca, etc., all saying, yes, this is what you need. It's the context. And what happens invariably is people trying to store single-point documents, and the fact that you've got a document is not a repository. The issue is that it's the data around it, okay, that creates the value. It's the context of the information. The second thing is that because underlying the whole issue of requirements is this next layer, right? What breaks most repositories, this next layer, is that requirements themselves have state. You know, they sit in various states of being in draft or approved or whatever. They're also collaborative, right? They're unlike many elements of business information in that they're collaborative. They have comments, you have shared actions that you have to deal with, all these other kinds of things, which create workflow. All these things here that I'm talking about create workflow around it, right? There are verifications, things that are saying there are conditions of value. And what I mean by that is, how do I know I delivered against something that this is useful, right? There are work products. In other words, it's the requirement itself may be in the context of, you know, somebody has somewhere, the CEO has shared a PowerPoint deck that says this is something we're going to have to do. Well, you've got to capture that information, which is context. Or maybe it's a regulatory, and you need to capture the context of that regulatory environment, the actual statements of the regulations, right? And that's a work product that's essential to the interpretation or understanding of the requirement itself. So there are elements of this which create context, not only context for workflow, and it's very different from a requirements perspective. The second thing is that I want to take you over to what I mean by connected requirements, because connected requirements is the next layer of value. And I'm hoping people will recognize this is TOGAF. I love these guys. This is enterprise architecture. And what I love about this picture is that it shows all of the objects, the kind of business objects in the good business architecture, the business organization unit, the actor, the role, the function, the process, the business service, the data entry, blah, 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 all the way through. And then what the relationships are. People recognize this. You guys have seen this one before or something similar, right? Okay, this is what the architects are using when they're starting to drive. At core, at the highest level of abstraction, this is what the architects are using to do their planning layer, okay? And so what I want to do is talk about what happens in organizations. that movement between concept and action it breaks. Because what ends up happening is that this upper layer slices off, right? This upper layer slices off. And you get this enterprise architecture layer at the bottom, which is the planning, and it's a snapshot in time. But the project layer gets disconnected, okay? This idea of what are the requirements, what's the gap we're trying to fill, what's the work package, that ends up getting disconnected so that you have no ability to then update the enterprise architecture layer. Now, Lukahu is asking me if this is going to be recorded. Yes, it will be recorded, and you can go back onto the Modern Analyst site to pick up that recording and take a look. Also, at the end of the session, feel free to email Andrea, and she will get you my slide deck. Feel free to, on the Twitter feed, ask Andrea, and she'll send you the slide deck. Now, why did these two get disconnected, which is almost as hard to say as the title of this webinar. But the first thing is that the requirements repository itself, or the architecture repository, this is a planning-focused thing. It is a point-in-time snapshot of what is required of IT to deliver value. And it's very IT-oriented. This thing down below, enterprise architecture there, it's very IT-oriented in terms of planning. And I know it's business architecture, but it tends to be IT-oriented. The top layer is requirements repository. It is project-focused. It is transactional. It's like a GL, right? The bottom part's your balance sheet. The top part's your GL. It's transactional, and it's stakeholder-oriented. And the issue is that between the two, there tends to be a barrier, right? First of all, the purpose and intent is entirely different between these two, right? But you've got to maintain synchronization. Secondly, the ownership of the architecture repository is different than the ownership. BAs, PMs are the requirements repository. Architects and the CIO, that's the architecture repository. Different things, different people, different users, different demands, different needs, okay? And as a result, you can get a disconnect between these two, because what you really need to make sure is that you got connected requirements, that there's a synchronization between plan and action layer, that if I can show you the impact of a requirement on one of these objects, what is the impact of this requirement or feature on an actor? What is it on the role? What is it on the function? What is it on the process? I now start to create that synchronization. I don't need to change the model. I don't need to go into the architect's tool, God forbid, get my hands on it and start BPMN modeling. That would break things, right? And that's bad, because that architecture or that process model is owned by somebody that's not me. I'm the analyst. I own this piece of it, which is the requirements layer. Second thing is you got to create that facilitation or interaction between the owners and the analysts. Now, smaller organization, the owner and the analyst may be the same, right? The person, or maybe that the business unit owner is the owner of the process, but the process documentation is owned by the analyst. The larger the organization gets, the more of these are other people that are in the organization. The more you go SOA, the more these are other people in the organization. So it may be that you've got another process owner that you're interacting with. As I impact their process, I need to inform them. You got another role owner. You got another actor. You've got another data entity owner, because you're dealing with master data management. The larger the entity, the more these pieces or building blocks are other people. And you've got to facilitate the interaction. The connected requirements facilitate that interaction. The last thing is you need to make sure that this is a closed loop, that it's self-updating. How much of a hassle is it to manage documentation on major systems? Wow, that's interesting. It's challenging, right? It's very, very challenging. So even at this level, you need to step back and say, I can do this by showcasing those interactions with these operating groups and using impacts to do that. So what about the systems engineer? Yeah, what I'll do is I'll deal with that one in just a second, okay? Give me 4 or 5 slides, and I'll get there. Managing requirements data and not documents. So often, what analysts are doing is they're saying, and I hate to be negative, okay, but when they move toward repositories, they try to replicate their existing life in the repository. And I want to ask everybody here, when you are going forward and working with your stakeholders, and you recognize that all they are doing is automating a broken process, what's the first thing that you say to them? Go on, put it in the Q&A. What's the first thing you say when you realize that they're automating a broken process? What's the first thing you start saying? Stop, policy, stop. Why are you doing this? If I wanted to replicate my existing process, it wouldn't be on the, okay. So all of those things, right? So people tend not to, but they resist change, right? That's one of the issues, is that when you go to a requirements repository, you have to get away from document-centric thinking. Don't try to replicate or reproduce exactly the same documentation stack you can, because you're trying to get toward managing the data and not the documents. And here's why. Requirements consist of a set of relationships. It's a user story or shell statements related to requirement attribute, related to relationships to other. And the idea here is that you're going to fracture this a little bit. You're going to say, how do I validate, elicit, analyze, elaborate? How do I get sign-off on smaller components of functionality? How do I get sign-off on smaller feature sets? How do I contain the collaboration in such a way that I can execute it much faster? As a result of doing that, I change my process, right? So the purpose of the repository is not just to harvest what already exists. The purpose of the repository is to help you change. So getting away from crafting large requirements documents, I mean, that's an archaic practice. It was really brought forward in the 70s. You want to get away from that. You want to move to repositories so that people stay in the repository. Ideally, you don't print out what's there. You drive it through development. And I know that's difficult because we tend to be paper-centric, right? We tend to say, I need that for the stakeholders. No, you don't. You need to drive the process differently. And then you need to think about saying, look, how our requirement data is dynamic. It's dynamic today. It no longer fits a word processing or spreadsheet model, because what you need to do is say, how do I then create a change environment where I manage change, I don't lose control with respect to change, I can see where I've got gaps much more easily. And as a result, I create a much more powerful, much more dynamic environment. But I'm able to maintain control. And then lastly, creating a large paper requirements document, it tends to be very slow, inefficient, costly. Why? Because it costs you more to update and manage the change when you're dealing with a large stack of stuff, rather than when you're dealing with a repository and you've got individual data points on the way through. And certainly, Paula, when you're talking about traceability, having a single point change, the impact analysis aspect of it starts to say, where is this thing hitting in other areas of my documentation, right? And that's the difficult part of change management, right? So when I'm dealing with a single point of change, how do I understand this is impacting process, this is impacting service, this is impacting these other areas? This is also linked to or related to my upstream or downstream. And those pieces of it, okay, those pieces of it are now traceability, what you consider traceability, but it's managing the context of the requirement and what's happening, okay? Let's talk about value and best practices. What really is usability? And Katha, no problem, you can absolutely get my slide deck. Again, just request that of Andrea. Conclusions about value and best practice. What is reusable? First and foremost, the context of the requirement is necessary for good reusability, okay? If you don't have that, it's going to be a problem. So if you're simply taking your individual requirement documents or individual lists of requirements and you're storing it in SharePoint, it's not going to work. It's interesting, but it's not valuable over the long term, okay? The second thing you need to do is think about this from a perspective of an effective project archive is a showcase of context. Who did what, why, using what workflow, how, right, to what outcome. That's what an effective requirements repository is. Now, the second thing is that this context is surprisingly repeatable. I want you to think about projects that reoccur in your business. Okay, what percentage of your projects are things that look surprisingly similar? They're basically, like an insurance company. You introduce new coverages all the time. Like, this is not net news. It's not new news for you, right? So individual things tend to reoccur. Not the large scale, you're going to change out, a HR system once in your life. But, many types of projects tend to be very reusable. So the business context tends to be the same. And so you can create little frameworks that work that same context and repeat it, as long as you've set up your repository in the right way, okay? And that means that you can move much faster. It's not that the individual requirement is repeatable. Okay, who cares? It's the context that's repeatable. It's the entire thing, the way you're going to go do it. Repositories are the only way to synchronize architecture and IT service planning. Because what happens is you get this, snapshot in time. You put all this effort into creating this snapshot in time that helps you do your IT planning. But if your execution layer is really IT projects, you have no mechanism of maintaining synchronization between the two unless you've got a repository that is helpful in informing people of that. And that's where people tend to get broken, okay? And the final thing here is repositories allow you to change the way requirements are done. So you want to get toward managing data, not requirements. Do the requirements in layers. And as a result of doing them in layers, what happens? You're able to then take workflow. So right now, so often it's one project, one analyst. The two get assigned. One person goes cradle to grave. How ridiculous is that? Why? Why do that? You guarantee that you have a failure there because every analyst skills are slightly different. So why not break it up in such a way that, hey, this guy here's the reporting guy. Man, that person there does really, this lady over here, she's fantastic at interfaces. She really knows how to deal with that. That's how you can better break it up. Do it in layers so that if you've got an elaboration, but you can't do that unless you've got a repository behind, okay? These are just different ways of thinking that help organize and distribute work amongst an analyst team and get better efficiency. Finally, I want to ask everybody, what do you think the number one requirements repository is today by use? Pop it into the Q&A area. What do you think the number one repository today is? Excel, SharePoint, Outlook, baselining, rational, Wiki, yeah, Wiki, SharePoint, Word, lots of Excel. I'm going to make a bet with you, okay? I'm going to bet it's Outlook. Outlook. I want to ask you something. How dangerous is that? Outlook. I want to ask you about where your requirements are occurring. Your requirements are occurring in interactions with stakeholders, right? What's happening? You're sending them an email. Hey, what's the answer to this? You get back an email. Oh, here is the thing here. You're sending them something for approval. You're getting back something. It's the log of dialogue, right? You got to get that out of Outlook. I want you to think about how that's going to work for you over time, right? If you've disconnected such a major piece of interaction with your stakeholders to something which has absolutely no traceability, it has absolutely no ability to manage permanence or any of those other kinds of things. It creates a real problem. So building repositories and getting standardization. So here's some case, okay? So I promised I'd talk to you about business case stuff. I want you to think about different rules that you can use in terms of why you need a repository. There's the 2% rule, all right? And this comes back to what somebody said right at the onset, saying it's the change that's really a problem. You get about 1.5 to 2% of requirements change per month. In an implementation over 24 months, you have to be prepared for 40% of, assuming the number of requirements doesn't grow, which how likely is that? 40% of requirements are going to change at least once. 10% of requirements are going to change 2 or more times. If the cost of defect and change management vastly outweighs the cost to create, you need to move to a repository. All right. So any project that's over a certain size, you should be considering this because what will happen is you say, wow, it costs you when you're doing it on paper. It's very difficult to manage change. When you're in a repository, it's a very significant thing. The next thing is the 2-time rule. Okay. If stakeholders routinely tell the analysts that they're taking 2 times the time expected, or analysts are taking 2 times the budget expected to do things, then it's a signal of real significant structural problems, and you need to gain the efficiency. So if I can give you a 40% gain in efficiency, just moving to our suite, well, that's fantastic. Now all of a sudden you're down in line with expectation, right? And the payback is really in the discipline itself, and that creates its own business case. The 3X rule is if you can use a stored asset 3 times, then there is significant structural savings. So there's an overhead when you adopt a repository. Some tools it's very high, some tools are very low. For us, it's low because of the usability, right? But you're going to have a premium that you're paying for putting things in because you're doing it in a more disciplined way. It's just the way it works, right? But if there's any reuse, then it vastly outweighs the effort to create and store. Typically, if you say 3 times, then fantastic. You're going to get a massive return on the implementation. Finally, from our perspective, it's about quality, agility, and stakeholder satisfaction. These are measures we actually track in our tooling, right? That you can get a baseline and then begin saying, how do I generate metrics for my organization? Well, that comes out of the use of a repository. There's no other way to do this, right? You need to basically say, well, what's my defect? What's my quality level? What's my requirements defects? Am I creating agility in the organization? How long is it taking me to do certain things? What's my stakeholder satisfaction? Am I monitoring and managing that, and therefore bringing it up? The only way to do that is if you have a repository in place. And you know, there's the #1 repository for requirements is team members' heads, scraps of paper, and whiteboard. Leslie, absolutely, that's probably the case. It's kind of depressing, though. So now, value proposition is ultimately about doubling on time and on budget and success rates. As you look at maturity, a lot of you guys know from my prior work, you've seen a lot of work that I've done in the years, you know, but it's about maturity and how do you get value out of a business analysis function. And what I did years ago is I looked at, well, this is 1998, 2008, 2009. What I looked at was what is the impact of requirements on, or requirements quality on project outcome. And what I found was this very direct connection that as you improve the maturity of an organization, you get vast changes in the outcome on time, budget, required functionality, and successful on time and on budget delivery. But you can't do this in the absence of having people, process, and technology, because you can't fundamentally change the way people do the work without the technology layer behind it, right? And that's really what I want to talk about is how do you make the repository part of the business process? How do you then use this automation as a catalyst for changing behavior, changing action, changing the way people do it? Because right now, let's take a look. What is it that Leslie just said? #1 repository is team member heads, scrap papers, and whiteboards. Does this look like what was in your head when you said that, Leslie? Probably, right? Here's my picture. You got 2 things. Waterfall, which is large requirements documents. How do you change, you know, how can you support that kind of change? Agile. I mean, I imagine going to your head of compliance and saying, like, here's the thing, okay, guys, like, this is the way we're doing it today. And it doesn't matter that it's agile. It's still requirements. There's still information about needs that you need to manage, and that's just the way it is. So, you know, you can't go to a chief compliance officer and say, yeah, we don't document anything, sorry. Because any publicly traded or somebody who's considering that has to have well-documented, understood ways of identifying and managing need and requirements. It just, you have to. It sucks, compliance. And so, but it doesn't mean that you can't do it iteratively and incrementally. Right? When you think about a painting, right? You would never fully render the painting, the Mona Lisa, just out of the box. But that seems to be the way we think requirements are going to be done. Magically, requirements are going to show up and they get approved. Not going to happen. It works incrementally and iteratively, and that's tooling-centric as a concept. Iteratively is you build what you can in what iteration and then review it and improve it in the next iteration and so on. So you have a piece of functionality that you understand. You have a feature that you understand and it's fully fleshed. Okay, fantastic. And you go through a review. You go through layers of that. Incrementally, you're adding components piece by piece until they're finished, building up in layers, starting at the highest level and working down through. You can't do this on paper because there's just too many gaps. But when you're using a repository, it becomes very obvious what's missing, what's not missing. And so you have to think about that as a change in work process. How do I, as a team, take advantage of that power of doing that? Working and saying, I can assign different pieces of this to different analysts, and everybody work together on a project, and that's not weird. That's just better use of my skills because I've got certain people who are skilled at certain things, and I'm not trying to get everybody to exactly the same level. I need every project to be at exactly the same level in terms of the skill that's applied. Now, this is where it ties back into your development teams, okay? When you start thinking about requirements, it really is modernizing the way you go about and do development because it's modernizing the way you go about doing requirements. There is a model here where going down, you want a modern, accelerated way that recognizes that there are layers of work and that in each of these different layers there is a different stakeholder, right? At the highest layer of business case strategy, it is an executive conversation. The next layer down, ideation to feature. The next layer down, feature to requirement. Each layer in an organization is different. There's a socialization across not only all of these layers, but to be able to connect the solution acquisition to implementation to performance, there's a connection of requirements across that gap, right? And as a result, you can't just go with paper because it's not going to function that way. It doesn't allow you to connect those gaps across. So this model is actually very powerful, and you can sit down and say, look, how do I use verifications and validations to assure that we're building the right product and we're building the product right and building the right product. Those are two very different things, but you need to manage that through. And when people are working together, business and IT are working together, you get better, faster, cheaper, right? This is one of those cases, the old adage, you can have better, faster, cheaper, pick any two. Well, the reality is that that's not true. If you have business and IT working together in tandem, that shared accountability, shared responsibility, you dramatically drive down costs, you drive up satisfaction rates. So I'm going to continue to power through these last couple slides, and I know it's coming at people fairly quickly, okay? But I do want to pause and point out a study that was done in 2010 over Verthena. And I want to talk about requirements skill repositories. And this gentleman did a study. It was much more oriented toward industrial skill, banking, claims clearing, things like that. But the application is very broad in terms of the implications of what it's saying. But basically, access to a knowledge repository explained 76% of the variability in an analyst's domain knowledge. I want you to think about that. How many organizations are out there? How many of you are out there today saying, we have a wide range of skill in our organization amongst our analyst teams? We got a really wide range. One of the things you want to do is close that gap, right? Right? Andrea, absolutely, that's very true. So many people, and Joe, okay, Paula, Robert, yeah, okay, everybody's basically saying, hey, that's very true. So what does that mean? So to close the gap, 76% of that variability is about giving people access to knowledge at the point in time when they're needing to use it. And as a result, you get much less variability in skill. You get much less variability in performance. And that's one of the things that we built into Requirement Coach, is just that ability to access certain types of knowledge at certain points in time so that you can have, oh, okay, I'm going out and doing something I'm unfamiliar with. Let me get some of those key words, let me get some of those key ideas so that I can use those ideas on the way through and in my conversation with people. Oh, by the way, if it's not there and you need, then there's this little button called Ask, and that will ask one of our analysts to go figure that out for you. The idea here is that you need to reduce the skill variance in your organization. One of the top ways of doing that is through a repository. But it has to be in line with the way people do work. It has to be connected to that requirement repository that they are forced to interact with to be able to deliver on the requirements. So, best practices in knowledge management. I hope people enjoyed the session because this is what I set out to accomplish in the beginning. Let's talk about some of those best practices in knowledge management. And I hope I really focused in on areas like connectivity of the requirements, the context of the requirements. If those get separated, frankly, you're going to have a problem with your repository. The next one is the building of the business case for BA requirements. There's 3 or 4 points that you focus in on, and they're just fundamentals, right? It's not difficult to, in an organization, create the right business case for that. It's just what kind of change you want to make. Is it really improvement in quality? Is it improvement in satisfaction? Is it improvement in cycle time? What is it that you're trying to impact? Because, you've got to focus in on that first and foremost, but there are certain situations that exist where you just got to have a repository. It doesn't make sense not to, right? The next thing is the challenges in building a repository, which we talked about first, and then linking the repository to the business architecture, because that part of it is so important to an organization that the planning layer and the execution layer are connected. And if they're not, you're going to have a problem. And then promoting standardization. The existence of the repository does not create standardization. I hope that came through, right? That doesn't do it. It's the doing of work through the repository. So the fact that you got a SharePoint site and you can post stuff on your SharePoint, that's not going to get you any closer to standardization. It doesn't help you. The fact that you're doing the requirements, you're thinking through the requirements in a repository, that's what helps you. That's what gets you closer to your goal of standardization. And that's, I think, one of the key messages today. So a reminder, Focus Solutions, we're all about business analyst outcome. And if I can whisper a secret, it's a secret to successful projects, but it is the requirements analysis software, the professional development platform, that dynamic collaboration. That's my last ad. But getting the slides, I know a lot of people are looking for the slides on this. I want you to write down apalton@infocussolutions.com. Give us a little feedback. Use that Twitter feed. If you love it, fantastic. Put in comments that are positive there. Andrea will be also happy to send you that slide deck. I am going to go through and see if I can answer some of these questions. Number one requirements. Scraps of everyone. Okay, love the presentation. Thank you very much, Leslie. I really appreciate your positive and Patty, I appreciate also your positive response. Can your solution be used in our organization's intranet? Yes, it can. Well, it's a SaaS solution, so it's pretty easy to wire into an intranet type of environment like you're talking about. It's not an on-premise solution. I've seen requirements repository organized by project and project features. I prefer the longevity of project framework. Do you have an opinion? Yes, I do. Very strong opinion on this. You do need to have projects and project features. You also need to have enterprise objects. Those two are very, very different things. You need to have both. You can't have one without the other. Great presentation. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Thomas. I'm glad you enjoyed that. Laura, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm still a little unclear on where the requirements should be stored. Well, the requirements need to be stored in the repository, but the repository needs to have them stored in context to all of those other things where we are, to all those other things that we're talking about. Pam, you're talking about, does it link to Team Foundation Server? That's something that you got to talk to sales about. Is this recorded? I missed part. Darla, yes, this is recorded. You need to make sure that you talk to Adrian, and the guys at Modern Analyst will have it. And if Word and Visio are not good tools, what are you recommending? Well, I mean, I'm a little biased. I would recommend Infocus Solutions, Pam. But the idea here is that you need to be able to use the right tool at the right time. Word and Visio were never, ever, ever designed for collaboration. So you need to step back and say, what am I going to use to drive that collaboration layer? What am I going to use to make sure that I've got the learning injected into the process so that people can use that learning? And those are two big things, because ultimately what you want to do is change the process of the way people do requirements to make sure that the requirements that you're getting value out of the the structure of the repository. Otherwise, it's just grabbing information. It's just it's like being a pack rat. You're just grabbing a lot of information and storing it without actually creating a significant improvement. First requirements tool I've encountered that emphasizes the importance of context. Susan, thank you. Yes, in fact, that is fundamental for us. It is a very significant core to the whole thing. When you have a demo, when will you have a demo of our software? Colleen, I can absolutely get you a demo of the software, but just connect with Andrea. She can deal with deal with that one for you. I am trying to get through these questions so quickly. I'm sorry. Great webinar. I enjoyed it. Thank you, Sumesha. Thank you very much for your positive feedback. I appreciate that, and certainly Twitter that one out there, and we'll pick that one up. What are the access levels to the solution? Rebecca, that's one that you need to go to Andrea on, who can talk to you about that. But there is access authentication security that runs both that runs to the account, sub-account, and then roles within the organization that are allowed to do different things. What about SharePoint being used as a repository for business requirements? Frankly, I think, Sean, it sucks. It has very significant problems. One of the main things is it doesn't maintain or preserve the context. It absolutely does not deal with the workflow. So if all you want is a common directory service, go buy a hard drive and allow it, or just use Dropbox. You know what? I'm a little negative on it because I've seen it blow up so much. But you really need to look at it more from the context of, how do you deal with context? How do I ensure that people understand the relationships among this? And you can't do that really in SharePoint. It's not designed for that. It's designed as a contextual document information sharing platform. It's fantastic for that. But that's not what you want to do. You don't want to get away from it. You want to get away from sharing documents. You want to get into, what's the fabric of the data. Mailbox 3 is splitting requirements, concepts of requirements need from design solution. How does it impact requirements repositories? Yeah, it absolutely does. You need the concept of feature to be able to deal with that. And if you don't have a repository that has that concept of feature, then you will not be in line with BABAC 3, and obviously we do. Demo version of Info is available on Mary. What you need to do is reach out to Andrea, and she can help you with that in terms of demo solutions for Infocus, and we can work with you on that. We do parallel development. How do we do configuration management for requirements? We do exactly the same thing internally, Gary. We have Agile. We use paired teams. We do in our environment working. So when you're talking about configuration management, that we call that. You're starting to get down into a little bit more detail there. So when you get down into the layer of what we call bundles and life cycle events, what you're trying to do is basically say a couple of things. One is, what features are impacting what solution areas at what points in time, so that you can understand what is being hit. Like, okay, the sequence of projects hitting a particular particular area at a point in time. You need to have that for the beginnings of configuration management. The next part of it is to say what physically is within certain releases coming at a certain point, which is what we call life cycle events. So that level of detail is something actually I want you to talk to a guy named John Parker in our organization about. How would you deal with an environment that has a high change rate? Yeah, every organization has a high change rate. There's two things you need to do. One is you need to accept that the way you're doing requirements may be creating a problem for you in your change rate. That if you look at it more from a feature perspective, connecting features to requirements, and then elaborating those requirements, you do it in layers, then the change rate won't hurt you. Because what you're going to do is take it to a certain point in time, and then as you say, yes, this is ready to go toward development, and I bundle it, then I'm dealing with change requests from that point in time. What happens is people release requirement documents, and they assume the requirement document is done, and therefore they say, oh my God, every change to that document is a change, and therefore we got a high change rate. That's not true. It's just that you're trying to use Word to do collaborative iterations on a document. It doesn't work for collaborative iterations on something like this. I am running a little overtime, and I've got to make sure I get these remaining ones for Ronald and BL and Larry and Sean and Cy and Beth. I'm going to answer those out offline after the project. Ben, I want to turn it back over to you, but thank you, everybody, for your time and participation in today's event. Ben, can I turn it back over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Keith. You did a very informative presentation. Everybody seems to be right over the top for this. I've not seen this many positive comments in a while. But anyways, thank you to everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. And I wanted to point out the slides along with the webinar will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days, or you can get a hold of Andrea at Infocus Solutions, and you can see the email right up on your screen. And I guess that concludes today's event. Thank you so much.